You're listening to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience, a podcast dedicated to helping executives train their sales and marketing teams to optimize growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. Let's accelerate your growth in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome, everyone, to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience. I'm Carlos Noche, and I'm joined by my amazingly talented podcast partner, Lisa Schneier. How are you today, Lisa?
Doing great, Carlos. How are you?
I'm doing good. All right, folks. Today we're talking about how to shed some of your limited beliefs when it comes to hiring criteria and modernizing that criteria to help you hire effective leaders.
And to help us out with this very important topic today, we have an expert in this topic, Ken Schmitt, who is author, speaker, podcast host of Leadership Happens, and expert in all things recruiting. He is the CEO and founder of TurningPoint Executive Search and the author of The Practical Optimist, an entrepreneurial journey through life's turning points. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time today, and welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thanks, Carlos. I'm excited to be here and have a great conversation. So no matter when this happens to air, Happy New Year all year round.
Perfect. All right, Ken, to warm up our audience and to get to know you a little bit better, what's something that you're passionate about that those that only know you through work might be surprised to know about you?
Yeah, there's a few things. I try to find ways to balance out, the life of a small business owner, right, who works from home, and my sister is part of the business as well, so it's a bit of a family business. But the things that I tend to do that, some people know about this, but a lot of people don't. Two things. A is that I am trying to teach myself how to play the banjo. I have I turned 50 a few years ago and got a banjo from my wife for my birthday. And I've always loved the sound. And so I just I aspire to be amateur. I'm not even quite amateur yet. That's how early stage I am in learning. And then also I'm a very big movie buff. If you read the book itself, actually my Practical Optimist book, I wanted to find a way to kind of leverage my knowledge, but also the fun of movies and my passion for movies into what it's like to be a business owner. So in the book, there's, references to about 10, 12 different movies, and using those movie references as a way to illustrate and demonstrate what it's really like being a small business owner in the recruiting industry. So there's a couple things that I'm happy to share.
Now, Ken, I can't imagine the banjo playing is that big of a thing in San Diego. In my part of the Southeast, you'd be a hit. But so is banjo playing that big in the California, Southern California area?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's not nearly as much of a sound scene as it is now where you are, Carlos. But actually, I think I probably am better off being here because I am so junior and such a novice. If I was out there, I'd probably be laughed out of the state. So it's probably a good place to start my banjo playing in San Diego.
I like it.
I love it. I actually, one of my friends gave me a chord trainer for my birthday because I've been threatening to learn how to play guitar for, 2 decades. So it's probably about time I actually do it. That's great,
It's
Ken.
fun.
So it is. It's a good distraction, right? That's something that's a little healthier, right? So let's talk a little bit more about you. Besides your hidden passions, tell us a little bit about your successful background and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, here we are now in 2024. So this marks actually my 17th year as a business owner and 27th year in the recruiting industry, which is crazy. It's just when you think about that, it goes by so fast. But yeah, I came out of college in 1992. I worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car for 5.5 years. Great training. No matter where you are in the world, people tend to know Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I think it's still one of the best places to start your career. And I loved it. And then I left when I had my first child. My first son was born, and working 7 days a week was not quite as exciting as it used to be. We used to have pagers back then, these giant garage door openers, right, sitting on our belt buckles, and being around, having to work 7 days a week, not so fun. But what I liked about Enterprise and about being in the car business was kind of the matchmaking, if you will. It was matching up insurance companies and vehicles and customers, putting that together. When I left there, I tried to figure out, okay, so what other industry is similar in terms of putting a puzzle together? And I actually answered an ad in the newspaper back when there really were ads in the newspaper, which is not the case anymore, and answered an ad for a recruiting company, a staffing agency back in, way back in 1997. And I got into it and just fell in love. And I just, it's such an amazing business. If you're a lifelong learner, if you love learning about different ways of running a business, operating a team, managing a team, motivating, I get to meet so many amazing people. And here we are now 27 years later. So recruiting has been a passion of mine for a very, very long time. And also, I think, being a small business owner, I grew up in a household where my dad was a Jack in the Box franchisee. For those that don't know, that's a fast food chain, mainly in the Midwest and Western part of the US. And my mom was in real estate. So I grew up in a very entrepreneurial, self-employed household, was exposed to that at a very, very early age and really kind of took to that also. So I think, I always kind of knew that eventually I'd get into being a small business owner. I just didn't know exactly what that would look like early on in my life. And then, back in 2007, right as the big financial crisis was crushing most of the economy across the world, I thought, hey, now's a good time. I think I'll start my business now. And did it back then and been through a lot of ups and downs over the years, but I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Oh my gosh, we have such a parallel life, Ken. Right out of college, I was at Enterprise Rent a Car for a few years myself, and I know exactly the feeling you mean about matchmaking, which then led me into sales. So it is an interesting way to start your career in a great management program,
It is.
and I too grew up in a household with a lot of entrepreneurs. So I'm like, we live parallel lives, just in different places. Yeah. So
I
I
love that.
wanted to kind of double click on that for a second, because in the book you do also mention that your father was very influential on your career. And is there other ways aside from being a franchisee owner that he influenced your decision to open your own business?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I didn't identify this or recognize it at the time, but here we are now, many years later, and it's very clear to me kind of what that kind of impact was that he had. Both he and my mom, really, but they were very transparent as parents, right? So my sister is 4.5 years younger than me, and I remember very distinctly. My parents went through a bankruptcy. They went through the ups and downs of being self-employed, all these different things, especially in fast food where it's very fluid and you don't have a lot of control over it. And I just remember going through as a adolescent, as a teenager, and a young adult, knowing what was happening in their lives, in their business, and I really appreciated that. They didn't, speak to my sister and I as kids, even when we were kids. They still treated us as adults and gave us exposure, the good stuff and the bad stuff around having a business. I can one of the great memories that I have is when I was probably about 12, maybe 13, and my dad was running 5 different Jack in the Box stores. Around the holidays, we'd always go around to the different stores, and he'd give gifts to all the different employees, and I would go with him. But he would give cash bonuses to all the employees, and he would actually bring honey baked hams to all the managers. And I just thought, we would talk about that, and it's unusual for the operating owner of the business to do that and talk to the staff. But not only did it give me a sense for how important it is to really connect with your team, which obviously translates to my own team, but also into how I recruit or how I help clients recruit and build their own teams. That transparency was very important, but also the camaraderie that he had, and the trust, and the understanding of what his employees needed for their particular situations. I thought that was just, was so impactful at the time, and it really stuck with me for all these years.
It's funny, Ken, because I decided to start this business in 2008, and I said, yeah, great timing. The market's doing wonderfully.
Why not?
So
right? Start at the bottom.
And sometimes people argue about timing and getting lucky, but the reality is, hey, it takes hard work, whether it's a good time or bad time. So you just got to put it in, and maybe it takes an extra year or more to get it going, but that's part of it. So before we get into the recruiting and hiring, I thought it'd be key. So I always admire people that write a book, because it's on my bucket list, and I hope to do it before I die. So what possessed you to write the book?
Well, I highly encourage it, and I think it is a lot of work. But honestly, at least for me, it was very cathartic. It was very eye-opening as well. And I've always been a big fan of journaling. As an aside, my wife is a marriage and family therapist. We've been married for almost 32 years. So communication and transparency in our own personal lives is also very important, separate from the business. So journaling for me has always been a great way to really process what's going on. And also, I've learned over the years that journaling helps me when I'm going through a difficult time today. If I can go back to my journal and say, okay, when's the last time I went through a difficult time? And go back and read some of those passages. And first of all, I realized, okay, I'm still here. I'm still standing. It got me through that, right? And secondly, there's some hints or suggestions or memories in there that I can use and deploy today in a difficult time. So that was a big part of the catalyst for the book, was wanting to find a way to kind of codify and organize all my journal entries into something that would hopefully be helpful and interesting to other small business owners. I read this book a number of years ago by Bo Burlingham called Small Giants. And it was the first time I had read a book that really kind of gave approval to small business owners who decided to stay small, right? Because, Good to Great and all those amazing Jim Collins books out there, they're fantastic, but they're really talking about and geared towards Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 companies. If you're a $1 million company with 8 employees, as we are, you can certainly take a lot of kernels of expertise from those other books, but it's not the same thing. It's a little bit of apples to oranges. And I wanted to find a way to incorporate all the learnings that I had, the trials and errors, in many cases, a lot more errors than trials, but put that into the book and hopefully help other folks out as they were building their own team and running their own organization. So that was kind of the journey, if you will, to get to that point.
No, I think it's great. And then the practical optimist. I sometimes argue that I'm pessimistic in some ways, but during this podcast and in talking to people, I've kind of learned that I'm actually optimistic. I'm just practical about it. Like, hey, it's going to take hard work. I don't know how we're going to get there yet, but I know we can get there. So what made you come up with the title?
Yeah, again, back to and I keep talking about my parents, but that's what it comes back to. My mom was the practical side, brilliant woman in real estate, connected very well with her customers, also her clients, very methodical, very deliberate in how she did things. And my dad was the optimist. He was the visionary. He was, that I think it was Reed Hastings that said, being an entrepreneur is like, jumping off a cliff and building the parachute on the way down. And that's my dad, right? Very visionary, very open about ideas. And he worked for Jack in the Box corporate for many, many years before he became a franchisee. And so I wanted to kind of, I always, refer to myself as being practical, but also being optimistic. And as a small business owner, again, back to that, you can tell if you're leaning too much into one or the other. To your point, Carlos, if you're being too pessimistic or too, practical, if you will, then you're probably not taking enough risk and you're not pushing the envelope far enough to see where you could go, where you can take this. And if you're being too optimistic, right, then you are seeing every decision through rose-colored glasses, and then you're taking too much risk and you're not taking enough accountability and focus on, okay, what could go wrong and how am I going to impact other people's lives if what I'm doing is too optimistic and not realistic enough. So that balance for me of being practical but also optimistic has really helped me get to where I am and through a lot of difficult times.
Well, Ken, I also invested in a franchise business about 10 years ago. So we could have a whole other podcast on that topic and the lessons I've learned along the way. It's still going strong, so knocking on wood. Jump into the topic of the day. You've been doing recruiting for a long time. In today's environment, what do you see as the top, let's say, 2 challenges that organizations or leaders are having in attracting and maintaining top talent?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, sitting here in 2024, I think one of the, and this is going to sound somewhat, counterintuitive, but one of the biggest challenges of hiring people is using people to hire people, because everything is about efficiency, and AI is amazing. It speeds up so many different things, creates more efficiency. It frees people up from having to do all the bureaucratic admin type stuff to instead focus more strategically. However, the flip side and the potential downside, very real downside, is that if you kind of technologize, if you will, or if you try to automate everything too much, then you lose that human interaction. And you're weeding out great candidates because they didn't, quote unquote, fit whatever software, applicant tracking system, resume, review system that you're using. They didn't fit into that. And so you're losing these candidates that otherwise, if you had a live conversation with them, you might realize, hey, you know what? They didn't do this exact thing, but the way that they think, their decision-making process, their mindset, their ability to think forward and think into the future, that's something that I really need on my team and in my organization. But you're going to miss all that if everything is automated. So it's this difficult challenge of balancing how much automation do you use, and then how much do you get humans involved in the process. So I think a lot of people out there, recruiting firms like mine included, we're all grappling with that and trying to figure out how to maintain that balance. That's a big thing. And the second thing, to your question about the 2 biggest things, the second thing is that everybody is now, here we are in 2024, the crazy, 2020 timeframe, kind of toss that out the window in terms of hiring. 2021, also a bit of an anomaly. I mean, most recruiting firms and search firms around the country had a record year in 2021 because there was so much pent up demand. But that was, I think, a bit unrealistic. And I think it was a lot of overhiring, which sure enough in 2022 came back around and people realized, okay, we got to do some right sizing a bit. So now in 2024, I think that the big, theme is balance. How many people do we need on whatever team it might be? And what is the demand that we can, effectively or realistically project going forward? And how do we incorporate, or how do we equate that demand to number of people? And that right sizing is challenging to do. Everything from how do you find the people to whether you allow them to work from home in a hybrid, kind of a blended setting, or 100% in the office, 100% remote. Those are all the things that fall under that question mark about balance and having the right team.
So let me ask you a question. So with going back to your first point, with all this technology out there, and who would have thought that LinkedIn would be like your best recruiting tool? It seems like. What's the role of executive search firms like yourselves? Like, when should I go to a firm like yours versus, hey, you know what, we're just going to use our own internal search people and tell people I'm looking and see what I can dust up on our own, versus paying the fees of an executive search firm that's going to be more expensive, but they might be able to have access to better candidates.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, LinkedIn is a fantastic tool. When I got into recruiting, like I said, back in 1997, there was no LinkedIn. There was barely even an internet from that matter. I remember when we first got the ability to fax, electronically fax resumes to our clients, we were so excited, right? Fast forward to today, and LinkedIn is everybody uses it with their eyes closed. It is absolutely a must have. So I think that's a great way to start. So there are three situations or scenarios that clients come to us. And I think this kind of illustrates your question or answers it hopefully pretty well. First of all, it could be a confidential search. And a company that's looking to either hire a brand new position, but they want to keep it under wraps for a while, they can't put it out on LinkedIn because you can't really disclose enough information about the role to make it worthwhile and attractive enough for someone to apply. That's one situation. Or it may also be confidential because unfortunately someone's going to get replaced. Someone's just not the right fit for the company anymore. Second scenario is a company that has tried to fill a role on their own for 30, 60, sometimes 90 days using LinkedIn or tapping into their network, and they just haven't found the right person. They found some people that are okay, but they realize, yeah, you know what? We're basically just kind of waiting for people to come to us. That's a very passive way to recruit, especially for high impact roles. So that's number two. The number three is companies that, have, like, for example, our two biggest clients are Kia and Hyundai, the two big automotive companies. They both have amazing, fantastic internal talent acquisition recruiting teams, but there are roles that come up that are high level, that are very strategic in nature, that are high impact, that they don't have the bandwidth to handle on their own. And so they come to us. I always say that we're not your GP to tell you that you have a cold, but when you need a surgeon, right? We are that specialist. We are that surgeon to say, we're going to spend all of our time just on your situation. We're going to solve your problem. Yes, it's going to cost money. It's going to be more expensive, but we're going to solve your problem ultimately. And that's what you're looking for to get this position filled. So those are kind of the three scenarios that we see on a regular basis through all these years of recruiting, where clients come to us and enlist our services.
Okay, that's a great list and a great description for our listeners. So when you meet with a new client, I'm just curious here, like, and they're hiring for a specific role, how do you help them to properly define a leader? Like, I feel like a lot of people would come to you, this is the job description we have, this is what we're looking for. Do you also then work with them to refine that into not your typical necessarily leadership criteria?
Definitely. And I think, it's again back to the question about how much automation do we allow for. The usual response to an opening, right, from an employer standpoint is, hey, who has the job description from the last time we filled this role? Hey, Sally, do you have it? Tom, do you have it? Where is that? And they find it sometimes they don't, right? And they pull that off the shelf and they look at it. They might do a little bit of tweaking around the edges, but they're pretty much using the same job description that they used the last time around. What we do, to your question, Lisa, is we help tease out exactly what's needed right now. Not what was needed before when last time you hired, but what do you need right now? A great example is, I would say 90% of the clients that come to us in the beginning are telling us we have to have somebody from our industry. That's always kind of the knee-jerk reaction, the automatic, expectation. And then we take time to really ask questions. For example, tell us about the makeup of your department right now. How many folks already come from your industry? And that's one question. Now, tell us about what you're looking to do with the organization or that team. Are you looking to truly innovate? Is it more of a status quo maintenance role? Is it more of a disruptive role? And then we'll say, well, if you want somebody truly disruptive and innovative, if everybody is cut from the same cloth, if you're all coming from the same industry or the same college, same university, then are you truly getting an actual, opportunity to innovate and disrupt? Or are you all working with the same guidelines that you've always had for your whole lives? And so not every time, but 7 times out of 10, our client will say, you're right. We can look at some ancillary industries also and pull from there. And that's a great example of companies that we look at in terms of, are they coachable, right? Are they open to some recommendations and suggestions? So that's one thing to look at. The other thing is, again, skills can be taught, attitude cannot. And we talk a lot, even at a leadership high level position, somebody will have the skills, but it's a matter of how did they amass those skills and how do they lead? So questions that we ask are, that we ask in our own interviewing before we present somebody, present a candidate to our client. We'll ask candidates, so tell us about the last 3, quote unquote deals or projects that you are involved in. It doesn't matter if you're a warehouse manager, if you're head of quality control, if you're the head of marketing, or if you're the CEO. What are the last 3 things that you did? And what you're looking for in that interview question is, what are they talking about? If they always say, I, when things went well, and then when they talk about things not going well, it's always, well, they did this and they did that. That's a data point. Make a note of that, right? You want to find out who was involved in decision making. Was the candidate more strategic and more innovative, or were they really more kind of an executor of somebody else's idea? And neither one is right or wrong, but it's what is the right fit and the right need for that specific, situation. So back to your original question. So we actually end up in almost every case rewriting and enhancing the job description to reflect what's truly needed in this role in this company today, not what they pulled off the shelf from, 6 months or 6 years ago.
And that dovetails really nicely into my next question, which is around like leadership experience versus leadership potential. So as people are coming up through their careers and want to get into that leadership role, but they don't know how to make the jump. So is that part of the conversation that you have with clients is similar to what we just discussed?
It is very much so. We literally have labels for 2 different buckets of people. One is the tried and true, somebody who's been there, done that, same title, same size company, same type of industry, and that's the tried and true person. And in some cases, that role makes sense. If it's a turnaround situation, if there's a sizable team to oversee and to manage, if there's a situation where you need to have somebody coming in that can hit the ground running from day one, yes, a tried and true person is very important. But there's a very, very, strong and typically deeper bucket that we call the up and comer. Somebody who, let's say I'm trying to hire a new CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, and I have a candidate that's a really strong VP of marketing. They haven't been in that number 1 spot yet, but they've been in a very strong number 2 spot. They still have a good sized team. They're still making a lot of strategic decisions. Let's look at that up and comer who is not going to get a chance to be a CMO at their current company. But if we can talk to them as a VP to step into the CMO role, that's a great opportunity for them. So yeah, it's a lot about the potential. And again, back to those questions, less around technical skills and more around decision making. And how does that candidate think? Do they think like a CMO? Are they making those kind of decisions and considering all aspects of of the overall business, or are they just looking at it from a more tactical perspective? Those are the kinds of behavioral type questions that we get at and that we ask our clients to get to also when we're interviewing. That's really, really important.
Excellent, Ken. So I know in the book you talk about the impact of the pandemic. For our listeners, what impact has the pandemic had on hiring?
Yeah, I think the most obvious one, honestly, is where do you work? Right. I keep joking that my next book is going to be called Without a Building, because every institution that we have known for 100 years has been tied to a building, whether it's work, whether it's a school, right, whether it's a hospital, everything. And now all those things, even you can have a telemedicine, teledoc, appointment or meeting. My wife is a marriage and family therapist, and half of her clients she never sees in person; they're virtual. So I think the pandemic has really affected the definition of work. Work used to be tied to a physical building. It's no longer the case. You can do great. I mean, look at us right now in this virtual podcast. Could we have done this 5 years ago? Sure. 10 years ago? Probably not. But the pandemic really accelerated, not only our ability through technology, but also people's receptivity to this kind of digesting content in this manner. And the same thing goes for work as well. So that's a good thing for some companies and not so good for others if they're stuck in that old way of working. But, I have this phrase I use called, line of sight management, which is the way that we did things for a very, very long time. Line of sight management is all about, people or leaders expecting to be able to manage their team because they can see them, right? They may be on Facebook, they may be on Twitter or Tumblr or wherever, but because they see them, the leaders think that they're working more productive. And now there's a concern if they're working from home, even in a hybrid a couple days a week, I can't see my team. So what are they really doing? When all the research shows that people tend to be more productive and more efficient and get more work done in a shorter amount of time at home. So companies have to adjust from being an activity-based organization, activity-based metrics, to results-based. And I tell my team all the time, I don't care if it takes you 20 hours a week or 50 hours a week, as long as the work is getting done, I'm trusting you to do the job that I hired you for. I'm empowering you to do the job that I hired you for. I'm not going to micromanage. I expect you to come to me with problems. I don't want to be surprised in the 11th hour, but we're all adults here. And even if you're hiring a junior person, you got to give them enough, runway or a long enough leash to make mistakes and help them through that. And hopefully they don't repeat them and they learn from them. But, even if you're working remotely, there's a way to do that effectively. And again, the research shows that people tend to want that. Most people don't expect to work from home 100% of the time. They want some kind of a mixture, some kind of a hybrid approach. And there's a lot of opportunity for that for a lot of companies.
All right, Ken. So I'm a little old school. So part of me at first, when this concept came up, I go, of course, we got to get back to the office. But then like anything, I always question myself. Throughout my career, I have always been on the road. So, for example, when I was a VP, I had an office in San Jose, California. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and I had a team around the globe. So I was everywhere.
Sure.
So the idea of being in the office, let's be honest, I didn't need to be there, and I shouldn't be there. I needed to be where my people were, which meant I was everywhere. But that's a different concept than I was in my pajamas, 3 days a week, just taking phone calls, because that would not have been very productive. So my question to you is, it all depends on the role in the organization. So obviously you can't, for your dad's franchise business, it's hard to serve customers in your pajamas sitting from home, right? Because you got to be in the business. But for, let's say, for these professional roles, how do you kind of mix play between the two things of, you got some young professionals that will learn more being in the office, but I also want to give them some autonomy to work from home and being, and have that option. And maybe I'm answering my own question, but I love your advice. I guess then it comes down to every single, the company, what you're selling or what you're doing, and the position that you're hiring for.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a big question because there's so much that is incorporated into that question, right? It's, again, we've been working the same way effectively for 100 years. And, the pandemic was only 3.5, 4 years ago. We're not going to change everything overnight. So it's going to take some time without question. But again, back to technology, there are so many great ways and so many great tools that you can use as a leader to stay on top of what your team is doing, and to monitor it in an effective way, not in a micromanaging way, but in an effective way. And I do think that if you're coming out of college into your first job, yes, you don't know what you don't know. And we all remember being back, Lisa, you and I, Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I couldn't have done that job remotely. I would not have learned all the things that I learned unless I was in front of customers physically, and also with my leadership, my managers. But, there are some roles where you can still do in a hybrid fashion. Maybe you're in the office 3 or 4 days a week as opposed to, 5 days a week. So technology can certainly help with that. But I think it really comes back to what I said before about job descriptions, redefining and assessing what this role is and what it needs and where it needs to be housed to then make that decision about that particular position and where it should be. If you're a warehouse manager, if you're picking and packing for Amazon, you can't do that from home. That's just a given, right? But if you are a marketing leader or a technology leader and you have your team spread out everywhere, you can do quite a bit virtually. So it really comes down to more of a role-specific answer, if you will, than a broad brush across everything. But I think it just takes time to figure out, what does that role look like? Let's experiment here and there. There's a lot of the research shows that, more collaborative, creative type positions, you do lose that creativity if you're at home 5 days a week, because you don't have those impromptu, quote unquote, water cooler conversations. I get that, but there are ways to create that virtually also. I mean, there are, virtual water cooler apps out there and platforms that you can use. And again, that's why I think that a hybrid approach is the best way to go. And that's what most people want. And that will accommodate all types of roles, whether it's creative or otherwise. But it really comes down to really understanding and taking the time to really define what the role is before you know for sure how to hire. And I also think, I mean, back to my comments earlier about transparency, the days of top-down management, days of Jack Welch and all those folks in the 80s and even early 90s of, command and control. This is the way it's going to be. Everybody, all my generals and colonels go out there and execute. Those days are gone. At least for the good leaders, those days are gone. Right now, it's about more bottom up. And even if you hire somebody who's 22, 24, right out of school, ask them, how do you think we should manage this role? What are your thoughts? They don't know what they don't know, right? So they might have some ideas that don't make any sense, but they're going to have some ideas where you think, oh, I hadn't thought about that. They probably are using so many more tools technology wise than we as leaders in our 40s, 50s, and beyond are ever exposed to. And you don't know what those 20 somethings are doing, the Gen Zers, that can make things more efficient. I've got a 26-year-old and a 22-year-old, both sons. And, the stuff that they tell me about technology wise and their expectations and how they expect to be managed and led and taught, over their career is so different than what it was for me when I was a, 26-year-old. So we need to ask more questions of our frontline workers and the entry-level folks to find out what we're missing. What are some other ways that we can manage that we're not even thinking about?
And I just want to add one more layer to that, because Ken, as you were talking about, like the role and, of course, there are times when it can't be remote, but it's got to kind of depend on the candidate too, right? Like I know people who are terrible self-management people. And so if they're at home and, like they find it very distracting because it's like, oh, I could do laundry or I could clean the kitchen or I could do this, so I do feel like part of it is understanding your candidate and their strengths. And, so is that also something you've seen in your experiences? Have you had somebody actually say, I don't want to work from home?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's a question that we didn't used to ask at all before COVID.
Yeah.
Where do you want to work? It's now a question as part of our regular screening process. But yes, I have had people say what you just said. You know what, Ken? I've got 2 kids at home, and unfortunately, I can't be as effective or as focused as I'd like to be. So I want to go to the office, 4 days a week, whatever it might be. For me, it comes back to 2 things, right? And I guess it's kind of one and the same. But knowing your brand, and your brand, it relates to you as a company. What is your employment brand? If you are 100% remote organization, when you're hiring people, that needs to be part of the conversation. Tell me about how you manage yourself. What is your, MO in terms of how disciplined you are? What do you do to stay focused and to not get distracted? And if you're not getting the right kind of answers, that's probably not the right candidate, because they're not the right fit for a 100% remote organization. So that employment brand is really important. Same thing around, are you a 50, 60, 70 hour a week pre-IPO company that's really going hard charging to get to the IPO? You probably don't want to hire a brand new parent, right? Because they're going to want to spend time with their child, which as they should. So again, that employment brand is important. And the other part of knowing your brand is if you're a candidate, if you're the talent, right? If you're an individual, you have to know how you tick. How do you operate well, and where do you operate well? Do you prefer structure? Do you need things to be codified and policies and procedures in place, and you're really good at following and executing that? Or do you prefer a more fluid, kind of a chaotic environment where things are always changing and you have to go 100% towards this direction today, only to find out tomorrow that now you're switching directions completely? So you've got to know your own, to your point, your own kind of style, if you will, and how you operate and where you're most effective and most productive. And you've got to own that. And if you are a candidate looking for a job and you know who you are and you're applying for a position at a company, and during that interview, you think, you know what, this is not really aligned. Even though you might need that paycheck, I get that. But if you take that job, sooner or later, there's going to be a misalignment. You're going to be unhappy. They're going to be unhappy with you or vice versa. It's just not worth it taking that job just for a paycheck, knowing it's not who you are as an individual.
And I think that's a really good segue into my next question, because this is an important one for a lot of people, is accessibility. So kind of tying into your hiring brand, I think it should be obvious when you're willing to hire people with disabilities or people who aren't maybe as tech savvy as others. Like, and how hard is it for those people as hirees to navigate the job market?
Yeah, I wish I could say it was easy, and it's not. I think it's getting a little easier, but we have a very, very long way to go. And I think of, kind of neurotypical individuals, especially, right? And I get a lot of this from my wife also, who is, like I said, a therapist, and she has a lot of folks that are that are autistic at varying degrees. But there are so many more jobs out there that can be fully remote, that are very routine, that are very data specific, that might seem overly monotonous, if you will, to a neurotypical person, right? But to a neurodivergent person, that is the exact perfect job for them. The problem is that so many companies, or so few companies, have taken the time to realize that that pool of talent out there could be a really good fit for these jobs, right? And having to adjust the job description and understand the employment brand. How do you go about finding them? That's what has to change. And there are a lot of good organizations out there that do a great job of bringing talent to the surface, if you will, that are kind of neurodivergent, or physical, or mental disabilities, either way. But companies need to do a better job of understanding where those great people will fit into their organization. And it just takes time, unfortunately. And that's where, again, I think that the overly automated screening process unfortunately weeds out a lot of really great candidates, because they're not interviewing, they're not writing a resume the way that we all are used to in a traditional format. Doesn't mean they're not a great candidate, doesn't mean they're not going to be a great fit for the job, but they are not fitting into our process the way we've always done it for 100 years. And so they get missed and they get passed over, which is really unfortunate. Another great example is folks coming out of the military, right? There are so many incredible things that you do in the military. Now, the job titles don't line up with the private sector, right? What you're doing is it sounds different, but again, back to what I said earlier, it's about how you're thinking, how you're making decisions. What are you charged with? You've got a battalion of people that have to follow you. You might be a lot younger than them, but they have to follow you, right? How do you do that? How do you motivate people? How do you get the job done? All the things that you do in the military, not all, the majority of things that you do in the military are transferable to the private sector. Companies need to do a better job of understanding what is translatable and asking different questions versus the same old, did you do this? Is your title this? Because you're going to miss a lot of great people because of that.
Well, Ken, it's funny because as you mentioned about the military, I think back to something earlier in our conversation, which was about attitude. Me and Lisa do a lot of coaching of managers and executives, and when we talk about our people, we say, hey, we can tell them what's expected of them, what hill we're looking for them to climb. In other words, we can give them the skill set to make sure they're able to climb that hill. But the one that we can't control, that's really up to them, is do they have an attitude where they're willing to do the work, to put in the hours, to figure the problems out. Today, there happens to be all these different aptitude tests, which have been around for a while also. Where does that fit into hiring? Is that a good use or a good way to kind of filter out some candidates? Or do you prefer more, hey, it's really about asking the right questions, really listening to their answers and making that assessment? What's your perception?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes to both. Both should be used, but in the right way. The issue that I tend to see out there over many years of recruiting is that too many companies will use an assessment, a personality assessment, whether it's DISC or Myers-Briggs or Hogan, or there's so many out there, as we all know, right? Predictive Index. They use it as the be-all, end-all decision-making to hire somebody. When the reality is, even when you talk to those companies, they will say, this is not supposed to be, a tool to use to decide who to hire. It's a tool to use to understand how to manage the person that you've already decided to hire, right? It's two very different things. So it should be a combination of, yes, do the assessment as a guide to understand how this person thinks and if they're going to be the right fit, and how you as the leader should manage them, but use it in conjunction with effective interviewing to make sure that you're asking those questions in a more behavioral, live setting. That's really, really important. And there's as I said, there's a lot of different assessment tools that are out there. Some are better than others, especially with sales and marketing folks, which I know is a big part of what the three of us focus on. Some are better than others. Predictive index is pretty good. Hogan is pretty good, right? None of them are be all end all. This is an absolute, the gospel, if you will, of assessments. But there are some that are better than others. But really understanding how that combined with effective behavioral interviewing, those two put together make for a much better, final decision without question. And then use it as a way to manage your team. Once you know how they think, then you can say, great, I'm going to be prepared for this. I'm going to go into this. I'm going to train and mentor and develop them in these areas where the assessment shows that maybe they have a bit of a deficiency. And I need to go in with my eyes wide open to know what to expect.
Love it. So can we ask a few typical questions towards the end of every podcast? And one of them, and I'm going to open it up to something that you might have done as a small business owner, as an executive, or something you've seen done as you interview other executives. But what is a big misstep or mistake that you've taken or you've seen happen personally, professionally, that has shaped the way you lived your life, but also could be great advice for our listeners on what not to do?
What comes to mind is making sure that we are making decisions around building a more diverse, group of people, whether that is your personal ecosystem, right? And obviously politics comes to mind, having a conversation with somebody who's on the other side of the aisle, no matter what part of the country or part of the world you happen to be in, you need to have a civil conversation and be able to have a discussion with somebody who maybe doesn't look like you, sound like you, or believe the same things that you do. The same thing holds true for a company. The unconscious bias is out there. It's in my book as well. We all tend to want to be with people and hire people that look like us, sound like us, went to the same schools we went to, came from the same companies, the same industry. It's not a deliberately elitist approach to take. It's just human nature. It's the way that we're literally wired for these many, many, many years. But we have to really push ourselves to hire people that may not be someone who looks like me, or I don't see myself hanging out with this person for a beer after work, but that's okay. You're not trying to hire a friend. We actually literally, to your question, Lisa, we had a client a number of years ago. This was a CEO. We were trying to hire a CFO for them. And as we we're going through the process, we asked him what he wants to find and, give us all the skills. At one point, he actually said to us, I really want to hire a friend. Where do you start with that, right? But, we said, we will find you someone that's the right fit for your organization, but don't look at every candidate. Don't screen every candidate with the expectation that they're going to be a friend, because you are not looking for that. What you need to find out what's right for the business, what is right for your team, for your department, where you want to take the organization. That's really important. So I guess it's a long way of saying we need to allow ourselves to feel uncomfortable. We need to allow ourselves to be okay with having people around us, personally or professionally, that are different religion, different politics, different background, different experience, so long as they are adding to, right? They're additive, right? In our lives, professional or personal, and not taking away from. That's really important. And again, it really applies to both personal as well as professional life. And I see it play out time and time again.
All right. Last question today. We call it Acceleration Insights. What might be that one piece of advice, be it either business or personal, that you would love to share with our audience that would help them be as successful as you are?
Well, I know what's worked for me is owning who I am. Back to what I said earlier on. I know where I operate most effectively, and I know the kind of role that I'm in where I can make the biggest impact. For example, in my company, we have 8 people, right? Most recruiting firms are started by people that love to recruit. That's their passion. They just want to be all about that. But most recruiters don't like the sales side. It's 2 different mindsets. It's 2 different, perspectives. I am kind of the opposite. I like recruiting, but I love business development. So I've built my company around my passion and really my strength. And I've surrounded myself with people that are not just smarter than me, but that fill in the gaps in the areas where I don't have that expertise or the same passion. So I'm the BD person for my small company, my 8-person company. I have 2 very, very adept, amazing search consultants, partners, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, and they do all the execution. They don't like sales all that much, which is fine. I make the connections. I bring clients in. I do all the agreements and fee agreements. And then I do a handoff to them. We do a kickoff call and they do all the delivery and execution, which they are phenomenal at. Could I do that? Sure. Am I going to be as effective as they are? Probably not. So really own who you are and what your passion is and what you're good at. And it's okay to say, you know what, I'm not that good at this other thing over there. Let me find somebody to add to my team that is good at that. And that, for me, that has been a big driver of our success. And also having a team that's very loyal. They've been with me for many, many, many years. And, they really value that transparency and the fact that I'm not, afraid to say, hey, I don't know, or hey, I screwed up. Help me to figure this out.
I love it. Perfect. Ken, if one of our listeners was interested in learning more about you and your amazing work at TurningPoint Executive Search, what's the best way for them to engage with you?
Yeah, so our website is turningpointrecruiting.com. And everything is there. The book is there. The podcast is there. And of course, all the work that we do compensation guides and a lot of different, content as well. I'm very, very active in LinkedIn. To your point earlier, Carlos, obviously LinkedIn is kind of the be all end all, especially in the recruiting space. So we have a Turning Point page. We also have, obviously my personal feed. And we share a lot of content there and we ask a lot of questions as well. So LinkedIn and then our website are the two best places.
Awesome. Well, Ken, cannot thank you enough for taking the time today. We know exactly how valuable it is. And thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me here. It was a great discussion.
It was. All right, everyone. That does it for this episode of the B2B Revenue Executive Experience. Please check us out at www.b2brevexec.com. Share this episode with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. And if you like what you hear, you can subscribe through YouTube, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. And on iTunes, you could do us a favor and throw us a 5-star review if you really like it. We'd love it. All right. I'm Lisa Schneier, and I'm joined by my ever-present and polite and perfect podcast partner. I just threw that alliteration in there for you, Carlos Noche. And until next time, we wish you nothing but the greatest success.
You've been listening to the B2B Revenue Executive Experience. To ensure that you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.